The bomb doors open and the boy from Ohio tastes the cold at 25,000 feet. His pencil is tied to a string, his gloves are stiff with frost, and his voice is steady. Bombs away. One ship, a few tons, one slice of steel and fire. Now multiply that simple act by a free nation's will, and you get a number that did not fit into German math. More than 640,000 tons of bombs dropped by American B-17 flying fortresses on Nazi-held Europe. Germany never planned for that, because no one in Berlin believed a democracy across an ocean could turn courage and factories into a storm that never stopped. The enemy thought the B-17 was a symbol. It was a system. The 8th Air Force built routes in the sky, stacked altitudes, clockwork takeoffs, minute-by-minute merges until the bomber stream became a steel river. Ball turrets hummed. Norden bomb sites aligned on marshalling yards, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants. Each contrail was a promise. We will be back tomorrow. The number 640,000 wasn't just explosive. It was proof that free citizens could coordinate at a scale dictators couldn't imagine. Listen to the radios in those formations. 91st Bomb Group, 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, 303rd Hells Angels. They climbed out over East Anglia, past Ipswich and Bury St Edmunds, throttles set, wings steady. Inside each ship, a crew of 10 did the American thing. Ordinary people learning hard jobs fast, trusting checklists, trusting each other. A tail gunner from Nebraska scanned the 6. A radio man from the Bronx tapped code. A bombardier from Oklahoma turned the little knobs. They were young. They were trained. They were relentless. And the German defenders knew it. Wilhelm Jonen, a Luftwaffe night fighter pilot, described what mass felt like when he fought into the bomber stream. Hundreds of 4-engine giants, with Allied fighters hunting over and around them. He wrote of radar sets the Allies had miniaturized, of German receivers that dragged and slowed their planes. He called it enormous odds. He was not wrong. The shock was not just the number of planes. It was the feeling that the sky itself had changed owners by noon. The war of numbers lived in hangars and mess halls. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Burbank built B-17 seconds by the thousands, 12,000, 731 inches all. Crews qualified, rotated, trained the next wave. Fuel convoys rolled to coastal depots. Liberty ships packed bombs and parts and coffee and letters from home. The German plan depended on frightening America back across the Atlantic. But America's answer was arithmetic with a conscience. We would come back in daylight, again and again, until Nazi industry cracked and Allied soldiers could cross a continent with air cover overhead. You can feel that arithmetic inside a single moment. A fort rolls into the bomb run over Mersburg. Flak blossoms black and close. The pilot keeps the ship level. The bombardier calls the last corrections. The navigator holds the line through the oxygen burn in his lungs, and a hard rain of 500-pounders falls exactly where he said it would. That moment lives inside the 640,000-ton total, like a heartbeat inside a giant. A German mechanic near Schweinfurt looked up and saw contrails that did not end. He had trained on 4 190 engines and trusted his pilots. But the raids kept coming, and each week the faces in his squadron changed. He felt, for the first time, that the timetable belonged to someone else. They come like a schedule, not a raid. One prisoner later said to a guard, "Schedules break you. Schedules say, we own tomorrow." People like to say, war is chaos. America answered, war can be organized. The fortresses flew in boxes, the groups stacked into wings. The wings formed divisions. Tanks on the ground had the M1 Garands bite and GIs joked through fear. But at 25,000 feet the jokes got quiet and the work got sharp. Oxygen masks frosting, throat mics pressed to lips, engines beating a steady 4-time hymn. This was a nation's heartbeat, audible in aluminum. And the miracle is not just that America did this, it is how America did it. Town kids learned celestial navigation. Farm kids mastered turbo superchargers and the delicate dance of mixture and manifold pressure. City kids learned to fly formation so tight they could read a friend's serial number in the slipstream. The math of freedom added up to an air armada that could move continents. The result is the headline figure, but the substance is the 10 hands in every ship moving like one mind. One more image. A German civilian in 1944 stands in a train yard as sirens begin. He expects a quick strike and a lull. Instead, he watches wave after wave pass overhead, precise, massive, impossible to shrug off. He later tells an American interrogator, "Daylight belongs to you." That is the old world, giving way to the new. America did not win by accident. America planned to win and then built the plan until the numbers crushed doubt. If you want a single sentence that says what Germany never expected, it is this. A free people chose to fight by clock and by conscience, and they turned courage into tonnage until the enemy stopped believing in tomorrow. The boy from Ohio closed his bomb bay and checked his chart. His ship slid back into the stream. He was one line in a ledger that remade the map of Europe. And in Berlin, men who had started this war began to understand that no speech, no fury, no whiplash of orders could stop an air force that kept its appointments. America owned the schedule. America owned the sky. America owned the outcome. The B-17 limps across the North Sea with one engine coughing, another feathered, and a tail so chewed you can see daylight through it. The pilot holds a hair of right rudder for an hour. The engineer hand cranks the gear because the hydraulics are gone. The waist gunners stuff a wool scarf in a hole where the cold bites like a blade. This is not a legend. This is what the fortress did so often that ground crews started counting miracles like routine maintenance. American workers built 12,731 of these ships, and the G-model sleeker nose, chin turret, stronger tail became the standard of endurance. The airframe weighed about 30,000 pounds empty, and when it lifted heavy it still climbed with a stubborn will. 4 right R. 1,820 Cyclones roared like farm tractors that went to finishing school, each feeding a turbo that pushed air thin as winter into a hot, strong heart. The airplane shrugged off punishment that would have ripped lighter ships apart. That mattered, because every ship that made it back taught another crew how to live. The B-17 earned a name in plain American: Flying Fortress. Not because it was invulnerable, because it forgave. A shell could tear through the nose and the pilot could still hold course. A burst could shred the elevator fabric, and the crew could trim and fight and nurse it home. Photographs from the line show forts with half wings and single-wheel landings and tails stitched like quilt work, yet parked in neat rows ready for the next fix. In war, reliability is mercy. The fort passed mercy around. Listen to the people who knew both sides of the sky. Wilhelm Jonen, chasing by night, wrote about Allied radar so compact it turned hunters into surgeons. German sets dragged antennas that slowed their planes and spoiled the angle. The result was a steady, grinding disadvantage. By day the forts took hits, but with escorts ranging ahead and a rugged frame beneath them, they came back often enough to make tomorrow possible. The Luftwaffe bled pilots. America rotated crews home to train replacements. That is hardware-serving strategy. Inside the fuselage, the human part made the steel sing. The top turret gunner stood in a glass dome, scanning, his hands on twin. 50 seconds. The ball turret cramped, terrifying, spun under the belly, a boy in a steel sphere calling out bandits with a voice he fought to keep calm. The navigator's table rattled, and the pencil scratched across a map as drift and wind turned into math. The bombardier bent over the Norden and waited for the crosshairs to settle. 10 jobs, 1 rhythm, 1 finish line back across the channel. There is a kind of toughness that isn't loud. It looks like a pilot making a tiny correction every 2 seconds to keep formation tight in cloud. It sounds like a mechanic hitting safety wire with pliers at 3 a.m., so the ship is ready by dawn. It tastes like weak coffee in a cold hut and the dry-and leather of an oxygen mask. The men who flew fortresses were not superhuman. They were prepared. They trusted checklists because checklists saved lives. The airplane rewarded that trust by bringing them home bleeding rather than not at all. Enemy crews learned to respect that stubbornness. After a hard interception, German pilots sometimes found the same serial numbers over the same targets a week later. "They keep coming," one wrote, "as if the sky is theirs." A mechanic near Kassel cursed not the bombs but the predictability of them. He was a professional. He respected a professional opponent. That respect curdled into dread when he realized the Americans could afford to lose a dozen ships and still put 1,000 engines over his rail yard 3 days later. The fortress also carried America's character. Crews gave their ships names with jokes and tenderness. Memphis Belle, 909. Argal Sal. Nose Art smiled through fear. Letters from home got stuck behind instrument panels for luck. The plane made room for humanity in a machine designed for hard work. GIs swapped chocolate with kids after landing. Ground crews stashed a baseball glove in a toolbox because even war allows a catch between shifts. The same hands that screwed a panel down tight waved at a stray dog and set out a can of rations. Think of how many lives the fortress saved because it could take one more hit and still fly. A ruptured fuel tank sealed itself. A bent prop feathered cleanly. A pilot could land with one main and a prayer. Every safe landing meant 10 families did not receive a telegram. Every return meant one more mission learned and taught. The multiplier effect was moral as well as mechanical. You can measure tonnage in pounds. You measure faith in the way a crew climbs the ladder again the next morning. A British airman in a hospital bed told an American visitor in 1944, "Your lads own noon, we own midnight." It was a compliment and a truth. The RAF crushed the Reich at night. The USAAF crushed it by day. The fortress was the ship that made daylight dominance survivable. Add the P-51D Mustangs sweeping out front, and you get a strategic combination. Hunters clearing the sky, hammers breaking the targets, a tough anvil underneath that refused to shatter. What did Germany never expect? That an airplane could be this forgiving in the hands of crews, this disciplined, multiplied by factories this productive, sustained by a nation this patient. The fort was not just metal. It was American patience made visible, American stubbornness given wings. The ship that wouldn't quit taught a continent that noon could be safe again. And just when the enemy began to adapt, a new American idea turned escorts into predators. Jimmy Doolittle walked past a sign in early 1944 that said, "Bring the bombers back alive." And he stopped. He read it once. He read it twice. Then he said no. That sign had the wrong goal. The goal wasn't to protect. The goal was to win. Doolittle, the engineer-pilot who had already raided Tokyo, took command of the 8th Air Force and rewired the fight with one sentence. "The first duty of our fighters is to destroy German fighters." It sounds simple now. It was revolutionary then. Until that moment, P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds, and soon P-51Ds, treated the bomber stream like a convoy. Stick close. Swat away attacks. Survive the day. Doolittle changed the verbs. He sent the so note, escorts ahead. He told group commanders to free hunt. He ordered sweeps over German airfields. He turned defensive guardians into offensive hunters and forced the Luftwaffe to fight where it bled most. In the air, at altitude, over its own house. The results showed fast. February 1944 became Big Week, a 6-day storm against German aircraft production. While RAF heavies hit at night, American B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds hit by day. The escorts went looking for trouble. They found it and killed it. Pilots like George Preddy and Don Gentile slashed through interception groups before they could form. Mustang flights loitered near climb corridors and pounced. If a German pilot survived the first bounce, he faced a second and a third. When he dove for home, a flight rode him down. Airfields that had felt safe when raids passed turned into kill zones. The Luftwaffe lost veterans it could not replace. The psychology flipped. American bomber crews felt the sky change in their bones. Instead of begging for cover, they heard calm voices on the radio. Tally. Engaging. It was the sound of offense. German pilots felt the change too. Wilhelm Jonen wrote of feeling hunted, of Allied radar and speed turning defense into gamble. He was a brave man. He did not mince words about the odds. When your opponent chooses the time and the altitude, your courage buys less each week. Doolittle's order matched American culture. We innovate. We move first. We reward initiative. He did not ask for perfect doctrine on paper. He asked fighter leaders to experiment, to learn, to report, to refine. The 8th Air Force became a giant laboratory with guns. The P-51D's range and speed made the experiments lethal. Drop tanks stretched reach to Berlin and beyond. 4 50-caliber guns in each wing chewed through enemy formations. Radios worked. Navigation worked. The system clicked. On the 6th of March 1944, the first major daylight strike on Berlin went in. More than 800 bombers and nearly 1,000 fighters threaded their way to the city. It was a hard day, Black Monday, but it proved something critical. With Doolittle's doctrine, the Reich's capital was not a crown you touched once. It was a target set you could hit, revisit, and normalize. 2 days later, Americans went back. 2 days after that, they went again. That is how you break a myth. You make it routine. Let's be clear about risk. Escort hunting meant fighters sometimes ranged far enough that bombers faced short windows of exposure. Losses still came, but the calculus changed. Every German fighter you destroyed today was one less over Normandy in June, one less over Arnhem in September, one less to teach a rookie how to live. American fighters took the initiative cost up front, so that American soldiers on the ground could cross France with the sun at their backs and friendly shadows overhead. POWs noticed. A captured German NCO told an American interrogator that after January 44, the sky felt like a trap. A British flyer recovering from wounds told a US pilot, half joking, "You lads own noon. We'll tuck them in at midnight." Even on the enemy side, the professional respect carried a sting. The Americans had found the gear and the doctrine, and they were using both without mercy. Mercy in this case meant ending the war sooner. There is a quiet heroism in doctrine done right. It does not shout. It shows up in fewer bombers missing from a debriefing tent. It shows up in a formation holding a bit tighter over the target because the men inside believe the top cover will handle what comes. It shows up in a pilot's hands at 20,000 feet, steady on the throttle because he trusts that the sky ahead belongs to his team. Doolittle gave them that trust by changing a sentence on a wall. You can see the American spirit in that change. We do not just protect what we love, we push out and secure the conditions where it can live. Doolittle's order is the strategic version of a backyard truth. The best defense is to take away the bully's tools. He took away the Luftwaffe's time, altitude, and surprise. He took away its veterans. He took away its ability to dictate when bombers died. And once he took those, he took away the enemy's belief that noon could ever be theirs again. The enemy's shock grew with each week. Replacement pilots climbed into cockpits with fewer hours and less mentorship. They faced Americans who had already learned the rhythms of the fight. Radios crackled in English over German fields. The last safe moments, taxi, takeoff, climb, became dangerous. That is how air superiority actually happens, not just by numbers but by erasing comfort. This is why democracies can be terrible foes. We argue, we test, we change. Then we scale the thing that works until the world must accept it. Doolittle's sign was a small piece of plywood with big letters. His order turned it into a new world. The fortresses still took flak, crews still bled, but the vector had changed forever. The next chapter will show what that meant when the biggest targets were no longer headlines but habits. Berlin by daylight wasn't a miracle anymore. It was an appointment on the calendar. Engines coughed to life before dawn, and frost cracked under boots. Crew chiefs slapped hot cowlings, felt the metal shiver, and grinned like gamblers who knew the deck was stacked. The calendar said the 20th of February 1944. The order was simple and cruel. Hit the places that build the enemy's fighters until the enemy cannot fly. Americans soon called it Big Week. Germans would remember it as the week the roof came off. A navigator from Kansas tightened his harness and whispered one fast prayer. He was 21, seated behind a Norden bomb site that cost as much as a house back home. His crew would aim steel at Leipzig, Bernburg, and Gotha. He was not thinking about strategy. He was thinking about holding the ship steady and getting his friends home across the North Sea. That is how free nations win wars, 10 people at a time, doing a small thing perfectly inside a very large plan. The plan was new. Marge, General Jimmy Doolittle, told escorts to hunt. P-47 seconds boomed and zoomed. P-38 seconds took the high cover. P-51Ds paced the stream like greyhounds off the leash, drop tanks under their wings. They looked for the Luftwaffe and found it. Day 1, the formations drove into Saxony and Thuringia and punched engine works and final assembly halls. Day 2, they came again. Day 3, factories tried to run with the lights off and hands shaking because sirens would not stop. This was industrial combat written across the sky. Planners picked targets that made German fighters possible: ball bearings, engine plants, airframes, and rail links. The groups that carried the steel had names like high school teams and Hellfire both. The 303rd, Hell's Angels, the 305th, 306th, 350, 1st, 384th, and the new, Hungary 457th. Airfields across England emptied by the hour. The bomber stream thickened into a river you could trace on a map with a finger and a gasp. The first shock landed inside the Luftwaffe. Veteran leaders saw the pattern and felt the trap snap shut. The Americans were not coming to smash one town and leave. They were coming to rip the roof off the fighter force itself. When BF 109 seconds and Flash 190 seconds clawed up through contrails, they did not find tight bomber boxes begging for cover. They found Mustangs diving, slashing, climbing back before the next wave arrived. Hunters became hunted, and the German radio net filled with urgent calls that ended in static. Down below, machine tools stuttered. A foreman in Gotha heard the whistle of bombs and yanked open a steel door. The blast hammered his chest. Windows burst inward and turned the floor into glittering knives. He counted his men. He counted again. He saw jigs uprooted and travel cranes twisted like licorice. He had already lost brothers to the Eastern Front. Now he was losing his factory, to the western sky. By week's end, the flow of fighters would never feel smooth again. American crews knew the price. Flak walked its black puffs right up the lead ship. A burst ripped the radio mast off a fort, and it snapped away like a dry stick. A waist gunner felt the hot slap of a fragment and kept firing. A pilot called for oxygen checks and heard 3 clicks and a laugh from the tail. All good. The bomb run was a ritual of courage. The bombardier spoke soft numbers. The pilot held course like a locked door. The toggles clacked, steel fell, oil flamed. Another corner of the Reich's fighter heart stopped beating on time. Big Week wasn't a chalk mark. It was 6 straight days proving that daylight could be a weapon you keep loaded. Nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties crossed the Reich in that span, with thousands of fighter sorties stacked above and ahead. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft and, worse, the veteran pilots who carried doctrine in their hands and eyes. American losses were hard, but the exchange favored a nation that built faster, trained faster, and fed the fight with oceans of fuel. In a rail car of prisoners rolling west, a German NCO watched the sky streak white and muttered, "They come like a schedule, not a raid." He wasn't angry. He was tired. He knew math. His side could not replace teachers as fast as the other side created new students. He had watched boys arrive with fresh boots and blank looks. He had watched them not come back from their first bounce. At an English field that smelled of wet grass and hot oil, ground crews waited by the runway and counted survivors. They marked the missing by habit and by hurt. Then they rolled new bombs under ships, still smoking, and ran fuel lines again, because tomorrow's frag orders were already in a folder. That is what freedom looks like when it fights. Not rage, but repetition. Not speeches, but schedules. The might of a people expressed as a promise kept each dawn. A young navigator traced the route for day 4. His pencil left a grey track through names he had never known as a boy: Augsburg, Regensburg, Steyr. He was a grocer's son who learned to read wind drift and magnetic variation like street signs. He saw the mission's heart. Hit the places that give enemy fighters their breath. He thought of his crew by nicknames, not ranks. He thought of the P-51 flight lead who drawled tally in a voice that made hard men grin behind oxygen masks. Luftwaffe night fighter Wilhelm Jonen later called the odds enormous. He wrote of Allied radar that found German fighters like a butcher finds bone, of German aerials that dragged and stole speed, of being picked from a bomber stream like currants from a cake. He was brave and honest. He knew what it means when an enemy shows up smarter and in greater numbers every day for a week. It means your future has been rescheduled by people you never expected to meet. The numbers became effects. Air defense belts thinned. Factories dispersed and slowed. Replacement pilots climbed into cockpits that smelled of fuel and fear. Americans, in contrast, kept turning the crank. Training stateside filled the pipeline. Tankers moved gasoline through storms and past U-boats. Depot ships unloaded engines, propellers, coffee, and dog-eared magazines. A kid on a bicycle in Seattle tossed a paper that read, "Big Week," and a mother read it with the kind of pride that tastes like salt. By day 6, something had shifted you cannot weigh. The Luftwaffe still had teeth. It still bit. But it no longer chose the meal. Initiative had moved. American commanders now planned with confidence that escorts would tear at the enemy before the bomb run. Crews slept a little easier, not because it was safe, but because the plan worked at scale. The bridge to what came next was clear. When you can pound fighter factories at will, you can point your air force at a capital in daylight and come back tomorrow. Big Week ended with engines ticking as they cooled, and hands black with grease clapping shoulders on the line. The navigator wrote a short letter home and did not mention flak. He mentioned a chipped mug of tea and the way the sun looked on the wing at takeoff. He folded the letter and tucked it under his pillow. In Berlin, planners shifted symbols on maps. In England, planners pulled maps with one word stamped at the top: Berlin. The next raids would prove the Reich's heart could be reached, hurt, and revisited until the myth of safety at noon died for good. A cold sun hung over East Anglia as engines lined the perimeter track. Crews checked masks and toggles, then rolled. The date was the 6th of March, 1944. The target was Berlin in daylight. It should have been unthinkable. Instead, it was scheduled. More than 800 heavy bombers and nearly 1,000 escorts shaped contrails into white highways that pointed to the capital of the Reich. A bombardier from Texas felt the ship buck as it climbed to 25,000 feet. His gloves were stiff with frost. He looked through the Norden and saw a grey city ahead that had haunted radio briefings for months. The sky around him filled with the moving geometry of disciplined freedom boxes within groups, within wings, intervals measured in seconds, confidence measured in miles. He took a breath and whispered, "Steady." The pilot held the line like a steel rule. The enemy rose to meet them. BF 109 seconds and FAU 190 seconds clawed through contrails, dove, fired, and broke only to find P-51Ds already rolling in from above. Doolittle's doctrine showed its teeth. The escorts hunted first. They bounced climb corridors, raked airfields, and ripped apart forming attacks. When the German fighters slipped through, the fortresses were still there, still steady, still on time. A radio call, tally, engaging, was the sound of noon-changing owners. Flak over the city was thick, black, and close. Shells walked up to the lead like a frowned OT-8 man up a staircase. A waist gunner saw orange fire lick along a wing route and yelled to the engineer. The engineer killed the line and kept the pressure in the other tanks. The pilot held course. The bombardier counted the last seconds. Bomb doors opened with a hard sigh. The ship trembled as the load fell. Below, the marshalling yards and factories took the hit like an anvil meeting a hammer. A German mechanic on the ground watched the sky and felt respect curdle into dread. He had believed capital cities were crowns you touched once. He watched wave after wave pass, precise and relentless. He later told an interrogator, "The sky itself felt American." Professional opponents respect each other. That respect turns to resignation when the enemy turns headlines into habits. The numbers mattered because they repeated. 2 days later, Americans came again, then again. Berlin learned that daylight raids were not stunts but schedules. Each visit cut tracks, burned fuel, stalled production, and bled pilots who could not be replaced. The balance of the air war tilted faster than any speech could explain. Once a capital is on the timetable, every defender wakes with a weight on the chest that coffee cannot lift. The human moments carried the weight of nations. A British flyer recovering in hospital told a US pilot with a grin, "You lads own noon, we'll tuck them in at midnight." It was a joke and a verdict. The RAF ruled the night. The USAAF owned the day. Together they squeezed the Reich until trains slowed, fuel thinned, and hope drained out of briefing rooms in Berlin. Air supremacy is not smoke and glory. It is timetables and arrivals and departures that belong to you. Inside each B-17, the system worked because people worked. The top turret tracked a diving spec and warned the formation. The ball turret spun in a belly-cold world and called the break. The radio man relayed fixes. The navigator corrected for wind and drift with a pencil tied to a string. The bombardier trusted a gyroscope, a crosshair, and his own calm hands. 10 jobs, 1 result. The bombs fell where they were aimed. The city felt the truth. America's precision was a habit, not a boast. Luftwaffe veterans felt the attrition in their bones. Big Week had already stripped away mentors and leaders. Berlin, by daylight, stripped away the myth of choice. Intercept or concede the capital. Fight and lose veterans or watch factories burn. Either way, the future narrowed. Replacement pilots climbed into cockpits that smelled of fuel and fear, looked up at a sky crowded with contrails, and learned the hard way that courage cannot replace experience at 25,000 feet. On the return leg, the crews saw the channel like a silk ribbon and breathed again. The pilot waggled the wings at a British rescue launch and smiled for the first time that day. Back on the field, ground crews climbed ladders with wrenches and hope. They patched holes, swapped engines, and chalked in mission marks on the nose art. Someone tossed a baseball behind a hangar. Someone folded a flag on a friend's coffin. The price was paid in full and the work went on. Here is the holy shit fact that belongs to this day. Berlin was not a one-time miracle. It became a place America visited with escorts overhead and fortresses on time. The capital learned that noon did not belong to it anymore. That truth travels faster than rumor. It moves through factories and offices and kitchens. It makes men hesitate, and hesitation is defeat, wrapped in a heartbeat. What Germany never expected was a democracy that could schedule the destruction of a capital and then keep the appointment again and again. What the world saw was a partnership night and day, RAF and USAAF closing an iron door. And what the crews felt, rolling to a stop on cold English concrete, was simple. We did what we were trained to do, and tomorrow we will do it again. The flak burst, tore through the fuselage like a pear-thrown scythe. Shards cut into 2nd Lieutenant Robert E. Femoyer, navigator, 711th Bomb Squadron, 447th Bomb Group, high over Merseburg on the 2nd of November 1944. Blood soaked his flight suit. The pain hit like a hammer. A medic reached for morphine. Femoyer shook his head. No drugs. He needed a clear mind. He had a crippled B-17 to bring home. The ship shuddered as another burst walked past the tail. The pilot fought the yoke and checked the engines. The radio man called for fixes. The bombardier looked back once, saw the navigator's pale face, and looked forward again because the only way to help was to finish. Femoyer pulled his map, checked the drift, and began the long math of survival. Course change, wind correction, oxygen, calm voice. He would not let the pain drive the pencil. Outside the windows, the sky was full of rules. Maintain airspeed. Hold interval. Keep the box. The crew flew those rules because they kept people alive. Femoya added a new rule. Keep thinking. He guided the pilot through 6 course changes to dodge flak belts and fighter zones. He matched landmarks to the chart and tuned his ear to the ship's engine note the way a piano tuner hears pitch. He refused morphine again. The medic argued. Femoya said no again. He would accept relief only when they were safe. The Mersburg oil plants burned behind them. The Reich needed those refineries to breathe. The men in the flak towers knew it. They fired with a fury that shook aluminum and bone. The P-51 escorts drove off prowling fighters, but the real killer was steel in the air. Femoya's pencil scratched. He asked for minor turns. He saved minutes. He saved miles. At altitude, minutes and miles keep friends alive. This is where American training meets American character. Femoya had learned celestial navigation, dead reckoning, radio aids, and the cold discipline of the bomb run. He also carried something no manual can write: duty before self. He would not trade 1 ounce of clarity for comfort. He held the map flat with a trembling hand and kept his voice level over the interphone. 1 more correction, 1 more check, 1 more breath. The crew trusted him because he sounded like the truth. The pilot did not look back. He just flew the headings. The radio man sent a position. The top turret kept the arcs clean. The ball turret murmured threats and angles in a steady tone. 10 men. 1 task. Make the coast. Femoya watched the chart and thought about the channel like a promise written in blue pencil. Enemy gunners watched too. They aimed at airspace, not at planes, and tried to fill that space with iron at the moment the fortresses passed through it. Femoya's changes bent the geometry. He turned exposure into near miss. He bought seconds the flak setters could not predict. He moved his crew through empty sky that should have been full of shrapnel. He did it with pain burning through him like a wire. They crossed the coast after 2.5 hours of this slow, exact, stubborn work. The English fields appeared beneath a low grey sky. Only then did Femoya nod for morphine. The medic pushed the dose into his arm. The pilot called final. The wheels kissed the concrete. The engines wound down. The crew exhaled the way men exhale when life returns to colour. Femoya's pulse slowed. He died 30 minutes after landing. His last gift to his friends was time and math. The Medal of Honor citation would later use official words: refused morphine, navigated his aircraft, brought his crew safely home. The crew used other words: courage, steadiness, love. The ground crew, who had patched that ship a dozen times, wiped their eyes and signed the cowl as if signing a thank you letter. The chaplain said a prayer that sounded like a whispered promise: "We will finish the job you helped us do." German defenders felt the shock of men like Femoya because their work removed the tiny victories that keep a fighter's heart alive. You fire a perfect pattern. The bomber should be there. It is not. You roll to intercept. The escorts arrive first. You plan an altitude. The stream shifts. You go home asking what else the Americans have built into their system. What training, what doctrine, what grit. Professional enemies admire that kind of will. They also fear it, because will at scale becomes inevitability. Femoya's story fits the ledger of 640,000 tons like a bright nail. The tonnage tells you what America did. The navigator's last course tells you how America did it. A free country trained a kid to read a sky, trusted him with a crew and a map, and watched him choose duty over relief so others could live. That choice repeats across squadrons and months and targets, until the enemy's plans come apart like a loose seam. Here is the holy shit truth to carry forward. A single man's steady voice can move a 4-engine ship through a wall of steel. Multiply that by thousands of voices, thousands of ships, and you get an air force that schedules victory. Femoya's life ended on an English field. His work did not. His headings run like chalk lines from Mersburg to the Channel, to the long road that ends in a quiet sky over a free continent. The payoff is not only a medal, not only a mission saved. It is the proof that American values, training, teamwork, stubborn grace, translate into survival at altitude and success on the ground. Tomorrow, the fortresses will go again. Tomorrow, the escorts will hunt again. Tomorrow, someone else will hold a map with a trembling hand and make the exact, brave call. And Berlin will learn, again, that noon belongs to us. Factories didn't sleep. They glowed at midnight and sang at dawn. In Seattle, a whistle blew, and a river of workers poured past a sign that read, Boeing. In Long Beach and Burbank, Douglas and Vega lit whole neighborhoods with sodium lamps. They flowed. They turned raw aluminum into B-17G wings and sent them west to east like gifts wrapped in paper and hope. The truth is simple and huge. A free economy synchronized itself to win, and the flying fortress came off the line because millions of ordinary hands moved with purpose. A girl from Yakima parked her bicycle, tied a scarf over her hair, and walked to Station 23. She tugged on cotton gloves and picked up a bucking bar. Her partner lined a row of AN470AD rivets along a spar cap. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was the beat of a democratic heart. They were not soldiers, but they were in the fight. The B-17G that rolled past them carried a new chin turret to kill head-on attacks, stronger longerons, better de-icing boots, and a tail built to come home hurt and still fly straight. That is design meeting combat and getting better under fire. Numbers turned pride into shock. America built 12,731 B-17 seconds. More than 8,600 were the G model. The same nation built B-24 seconds at Willow Run so fast that a finished Liberator rolled off the line roughly every 63 minutes. An enemy tries to shoot down a squadron. An hour later, a factory answers with another airplane. That is how a free people convert argument and energy into steel and motion. A Lockheed Vega foreman checked a clipboard with hands black from sealant. The pride was personal. The output was national. Bins of control cables, crates of Wright R-1000, 820 Cyclones, pallets of tires taller than a man. Everything staged like a ballet, choreographed by clipboards and chalk. The floor smelled like oil and coffee. The German side had factories too. They had skilled hands and serious engineers, but they did not have this river. They did not have this speed. Allied bombing forced them into caves and woods and rail tunnels. Dispersal saved machines and killed efficiency. Work crews lost time walking between sheds. Power flickered. Deliveries stalled. The fortress, built in the open by a nation that trusted its people, came out faster than German fighters went in for repairs. That is how industry becomes strategy. A German prisoner later said his first shock in America was not the guard towers. It was the abundance. He stepped off the train, smelled bread, heard a radio, and saw a cafeteria with more food than his whole town had seen in a year. He learned the word refill. He wrote, "They have more of everything, even kindness." That is psychological warfare without a pamphlet. Feed him. Let him write home. Show him freedom with a slice of pie. There was humor because humor survives. Nose art came from hot rod pinstripers and farm kids with brushes. A crew chief kept a glove in his toolbox. A riveter taped a picture of her baby on the jig because it reminded her why the wing had to be perfect. Somewhere a foreman swore at a clock, and somewhere else a clockmaker swore with him because his factory made the Norden gears that let a bombardier trust his crosshairs. The fortress was tough because the people who built it were stubborn. Self-sealing tanks, redundant hydraulics, manual gear cranks for the day hydraulics quit. A pilot could fight a B-17 home on 3 engines and courage. That stubbornness showed in repairs too. Combat-damaged forts came back with ribs cracked and skin peeled and still parked neatly on dispersal pads. Sheet metal wizards turned wrecks into flyers with hammers, dolly blocks, and patches that looked like silver scales. Now add the partners. Railway men coupled flat cars loaded with subassemblies. Truckers hauled crated turrets and boxes of 50 caliber barrels to ports that smelled like salt and diesel. Liberty ships stacked with crates and coffee steamed into Atlantic lanes. Winning means you can make it, move it, fuel it, arm it, and do it again next week. America learned that rhythm quickly and never lost it. Wilhelm Jonen, the German night fighter, wrote that Allied radar sets were compact and ruthless. He said German night fighters dragged antennas that slowed them and spoiled climbs. In his world, the enemy's technology had turned precision into a habit. He was brave and honest. Read his lines and you can feel how an engineer's decision in a stateside lab could change a dogfight over the Rhine 6 months later. Anya, a Ukrainian forced laborer, remembered her first Allied raid as terror. Then she remembered the day American bombers passed and German flak did not reach them. It looked like the sky belonged to someone else, she said years later. When she was freed, a US cook handed her a bowl of soup and said, "Eat," like a handshake. The abundance felt like a weapon made of kindness. Factories that fly are not only metal, they are values. Put fairness on a line and you get fewer mistakes. Put training on a line and you get fewer accidents. Put pride on a line and your output mocks the tyrant who screams for quotas. America's shops did not need a whip. They needed a goal. The goal was simple. Give every crew the best chance to come home and then give them another airplane if they do not. Here is the hard payoff. A German ace can down a fortress. He cannot down a factory. He cannot down a supply chain that delivers engines like clockwork and drop tanks by the trainload. He cannot down a nation that believes ordinary people can do extraordinary work if you trust them and teach them. That belief rolled down the runway each morning with a nose name and a grin. It crossed the channel. It came home patched and proud. And when anyone asked if the line could make one more, the answer was always yes. The P-51D leader pressed the mic switch and said, "Tally, the Mustangs were ahead of the bomber stream, where Jimmy Doolittle wanted them. They were hunting. Noon had a new owner because America changed one rule. Fighters would destroy German fighters first, and escorts second." That sentence flipped the air war. A boy from Missouri sat behind a K-14 gun sight and watched a speck grow into a BF-109. He eased throttle and let the pipper settle. 6. 50 caliber Brownings spoke at once. Brass skittered along the wing route. The German jinked, rolled, and fell away. The Mustang climbed on the second stage and looked for the next fight. The bombers behind him felt the sky get lighter. They held course because hunters were working the lanes ahead. The 8th Air Force made this flow a habit. Controller calls stacked squadrons by altitude. P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds filled gaps. But the P-51D, with drop tanks and range, became the long arm. 75-gallon drop tanks fed the climb. Pilots burned them dry and punched them off clean. Radios worked from group to group. The bomber stream did not feel alone anymore. The climb to altitude, once a safe rhythm, turned into a ring of ambushes. Airfields that had been quiet at takeoff suddenly took fire at pattern altitude. Wilhelm Jonen wrote that Allied technology let their fighters pick the German night fighters out of the bomber stream like currants out of a cake. By day, it felt the same to the Jagdwaffe. Even skilled pilots arrived late, slow, or bounced. That is how initiative sounds when an opponent steals it. The Mustang carried speed and forgiveness. A pilot could turn hard at 15,000 feet and still have engine to spare. He could dive past 400 and trust the airplane. He could climb with fury on a Merlin that loved cold air. The P-51D wasn't magic. It was an honest machine in honest hands. Put it ahead of the bombers with clear orders and discipline, and it multiplied the strength of every fortress behind it. A German mechanic told an interrogator, "Our boys looked up and saw eagles there first." He meant a Mustang sliding across the sun before the bomber boxes arrived. He meant airfields where warm engines suddenly coughed and died under strafing runs. He meant the silence in a ready room when a veteran did not come back. When you lose mentors, you lose doctrine. You begin again each morning with brave kids and short memories. On the 6th of March 1944, the system took its test. Berlin by daylight had sounded like a dare. Instead, it ran like a schedule. Fighter groups pushed ahead and hit forming interceptors. Bomber groups held formation tight over heavy flak. The radios stayed clear. Engaging, cleared to the deck, rejoining. The capital took the blow. 2 days later, the blow fell again. After that, again. Habit kills myths fast. It told German civilians that noon belonged to someone else now. The top turret scanned and called, "Friendly high." The ball turret breathed cold air and said, "Bandit low, Mustangs on him." The navigator did his wind math without the old taste of panic. The bombardier trusted he would see the target for the seconds he needed. Crews still died and bled. But the odds shifted because the enemy spent more time saving himself and less time attacking the stream. Doolittle's rule matched American culture. We move first, then scale. Fighter leaders tested tactics and kept the parts that worked. Free hunt roves, top cover scissors, throttle discipline on the merge. They shared debriefs. A trick learned over Bremen showed up over Mersburg the next week. A better radio call in the 4th Fighter Group became standard a day later in the 357th Fighter Group. This is how democracies fight when they are serious. They learn in public and punish in private. The enemy still fought hard. Black 109 seconds with 30mm cannons could break a bomber with a lucky burst. Flak was a black staircase. Could saw a tail off in one pass. Flak was a black staircase. But initiative kept moving American direction. A German pilot could fly a perfect attack and still find a P-51 on his 6 by the end of the minute. That wears courage down. It does not make you less brave. It makes your bravery cost more each day than your country can afford. Here is the holy shit truth. When your escorts hunt, your bombers get to be boring. Boring is victory in daylight war. Boring means the formation reaches the IP on time. Boring means the Norden gets a clean, steady run. Boring means the trained pilots nurse engines and still have a few inches of manifold pressure in their pocket for the ride home. Boring leaves you alive for tomorrow. An American pilot taxied in and rolled the canopy back. He smelled cut grass and hot oil. A crew chief climbed the wing, grinning, and slapped the fuselage. The pilot held up 2 fingers. The chief held up a thermos. They spoke a language of work and trust. Across the channel, a German boy looked at a sky with white scars and understood his side no longer chose the time of danger. Someone else did. Owning noon did not end the war. It made everything else possible. It made D-Day cross the beaches with fighters overhead. It made trains late and oil scarce. It made German planners write weather on a map and know it was not their only enemy. It also proved something Americans love to prove. When you give citizens good tools and a clear job, they will do it better tomorrow. That is what the P-51D and the men who flew it gave the mighty 8th time, space, and the right to be on target. The next step is to measure what that gift looked like at scale. How big is big when a free people choose to fly on schedule? A crew chief chalked another bomb symbol under a grinning nose art and stepped back to count. The row stretched across the fuselage like a ruler. 1 ship, many missions. How big is big? Big is when this tiny moment is happening at 100 fields at once, and tomorrow's schedule is printed. Start with a day. The 8th Air Force could send hundreds of heavy bombers over a single target set before lunch, step off again for a second blow, and still have fighters sweeping. The 6th of March 1944 proved it against Berlin. Later raids proved it. A ground crewman hears it in the midnight truck that drops. 50 cal belts. A navigator hears it in the briefing officer's voice when he says, "Gentlemen, Berlin, again." Now stretch the day into a week. Big Week flew almost 4,000 heavy bomber sorties with thousands more, fighters above them. The Luftwaffe lost machines. Worse, it lost veteran pilots who held doctrine in their hands. America lost brave crews. But the exchange favored a nation that could build, train, and fuel faster than an opponent who now had to disperse production and drive by night. A week like that changes the month that follows. In 1944, the mighty 8th turned precision into habit. B-17 seconds alone dropped more than 640,000 tons during the war. Every ton fell from a crew who had trained, climbed, and ridden the flak road to a specific set of coordinates. The targets had names. The bombs had serial numbers. The damage had consequences that rolled through the Reich's calendars and clocks. A German staff officer watched timetables turn into wreckage. He saw trains stop in a siding because a bridge was out. He saw oil arrive late, thin, or not at all. He saw dispersal push assembly lines into barns and tunnels. He saw morning briefings lose their spine when the men who taught survival did not come back. He did not doubt courage. He doubted the math. That is the moment professional enemies know a fight is shifting from hard to hopeless. An American POW in Stalag Luft III listened as new prisoners described raids that sounded like schedules. He drew a tiny calendar in pencil. He marked mission days with dots that clumped. He smiled at the pattern because patterns mean predictability, and predictability at that scale belongs to the side that plans well and shows up on time. He had no airplane, but he felt like a crewman again. The enemy's shock shows up in language. Wilhelm Jonen wrote that Allied fighters could pick German night fighters out of the bomber stream like currants out of a cake. He also wrote about antennas that dragged and about radar the Reich could not miniaturize in time. Behind his words sits a truth about free labs and fast factories. We made many things, and smaller, better things, and taught thousands how to use them. That combination bends the sky. Scale is also human. A farm kid learned to time a supercharger shift by sound. A machinist in Burbank polished a turbine blade until it sang. A Brooklyn radio man learned to trust a fix he pulled from 3 beeps on a noisy band. A mother filled a bond book one stamp at a time. A Detroit welder, home from a night shift on tank hulls, sent his brother a box of coffee and gum in England. The river that feeds an air force runs through ordinary kitchens. Here is a number that makes historians pause. The 8th Air Force flew more than 600,000 sorties by the end. That means takeoffs, missions, landings, and debriefs that filled tents with cigarette smoke and honest talk. It means engines timed, props swapped, tires changed, and holes patched for the next crew. It means the smell of rain on English concrete and the slap of a clipboard against a flight suit at 0300. Scale is a habit. A German boy in Berlin watched contrails cross like white scars. At first he counted. Later he stopped because the impossible had become normal. His father whispered, "It will pass." It did not pass. It returned, and returned again, until the boy learned a hard civics lesson from the sky. A free nation that chooses to fight by schedule will keep the date until the enemy cannot stand up to meet it. Here are holy shit facts. Berlin was hit in daylight and then hit again. Big Week ripped the roof off aircraft production. One factory in Michigan pushed out a B-24 every 63 minutes. 12,731 B-17 seconds left American plants. Those are receipts. They sit next to names like Mersburg, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Kassel, where crews took flak and still held formation because the job was bigger than fear. A navigator wrote, "The secret is not bravery. It is procedure. Courage without procedure is waste. Procedure without courage is paper only." America married the two and did it in numbers no enemy could match. The procedure was the route, the altitudes, the IP, the bomb run, the rally, the return. The courage was keeping the ship level when the world outside the plexiglass tried to tear it apart. How big is big? Big is a nation that teaches kids to fly, teaches workers to build, teaches leaders to adapt, and then sends that learning across an ocean every day. Big is a bomber stream. So thick a German ace feels small for the first time. Big is a fighter line that arrives early, leaves late, and owns the space between. Big is a ledger where numbers stop being surprising because they repeat. And the bridge to what comes next is simple. If you can do this for weeks and months, you can finish the war by making defeat not just likely, but inevitable. The wheels left the wet English concrete, and the nose lifted toward a cold March Sunday. The engines drummed. The crew checked masks and toggles and felt the ship become a promise. The date was the 6th of March 1944, and the target was Berlin in daylight. The blow the enemy said could not land. It landed. More than 800 heavy bombers and nearly 1,000 escorts climbed together and carved white roads toward the capital. Over the city, the flak was a black staircase, and fighters clawed for position, but the Mustangs arrived first, and the fortresses held steady until the bombs fell where the planners had drawn the crosshairs. That should have been the story, a miracle, a headline, a one-day legend. Instead, it became a schedule. 2 days later, contrails painted the same white scars across German sky. And then again, Berlin learned that noon belonged to someone else now. The real shock was not the first hammer. It was the rhythm of hammers. A bombardier from Texas adjusted his Norden, called corrections in a flat voice, and felt the ship tremble as the racks went empty over marshalling yards and factories. A ball turret gunner in a steel sphere under the belly called a low bandit, and then, with a grin nobody could see, added, "Mustangs on?" Him. Above them, P-51D leaders said the word that meant the doctrine was alive, tally, and chased climbs and dives that used to be safe. That is what it means to be a free people with a plan. The impossible becomes the 0900 job. A German mechanic in the suburbs looked up from a starter motor and listened, not to explosions, but to the sound of arrivals. He had long ago learned to count by ears. Today he stopped counting, because the number told him nothing he could use. The capital city had been a crown. Now it was an address you could write on a mission board again and again. The sky felt American. A prisoner admitted later in a guarded room. He did not mean flags. He meant timing. He meant a pattern the defenders could not break. Crews carried the rhythm in their bones. The lead ship rode a calm the rest could feel. The top turret called "friendly high," then "break right," then "clear." Each word dropped into the interphone like a small stone that steadied the hand. The navigator ran wind drift and magnetic variation with a pencil tied to a string and glanced at a clock that never lied. The radio man passed fixes. The tail gunner watched the six and squeezed the butterfly triggers only when the tracers met the math. Berlin below was smoke and anger and the smell of burned oil. Berlin above was procedure and courage married into a single living thing. This is what the enemy felt from inside the storm. Wilhelm Jonen, the Luftwaffe night fighter, wrote about enormous odds, about Allied fighters who could pick German machines out of the flow, like currents from a cake, about German antennas that dragged and cost speed, while Allied radar shrank into boxes that fit in, noses and pods. He was not making excuses. He was telling a professional truth. Once an opponent owns initiative and technology together, your courage costs more than your country can afford to pay. Over Berlin in daylight. That bill arrived every hour. On the ground, German planners tried to turn the air into math they could solve. Dispersal slowed assembly. Trains went by night. Factories hid in woods and tunnels. But a schedule is a hunter with a watch. When the target moved, the timetable moved with it. Americans sent recon. Analysts traced rail lines like veins. Crews learned landmarks until the city became a map burned into their heads. Steady, the bombardier said, because steadiness at 25,000 feet is how free men keep promises to strangers they will never meet. There was kindness in the middle of steel. After a raid, somewhere in England, a ground crewman placed a clean mug on a wing route for a pilot whose hands still shook. A medic closed a friend's eyes and then carried chocolate bars to the German POWs who had been pulled from a wrecked fighter and wrapped in blankets by British rescue men who knew what ice water felt like. A chaplain wrote down the names and spelled them right. The enemy saw that too, the abundance, the discipline, the refusal to sneer. That is a kind of psychological warfare no pamphlet can match. Here is a holy shit fact that lives behind the smoke. Berlin became a routine target in the spring of 1944 because America made a doctrine and then ran it like a railroad. Daylight raids turned from legend into habit in a matter of days. The meaning is bigger than numbers. It means a free nation taught thousands to do hard jobs so well that the hardest mission could be normalized. It means an enemy's center, its capital, its rail hub, its symbol could be struck not as a stunt but as a Tuesday. That change breaks more than buildings. It breaks belief. The crews rolled home across the channel and saw England's green smear beneath grey cloud. Wheels kissed concrete. Engines ticked as they cooled. Ground crews climbed ladders with wrenches and hope. They patched, fueled, and chalked new mission marks under nose art with names that sounded like jokes and prayers. Memphis, Bel Al-Galsal 909. In the mess tent, a radio read the frag order for the next day, and nobody looked surprised. That is what victory looks like before it shows its face. A routine nobody on the other side can stop. And if the capital of the Reich could be scheduled by day, the ledger of the mighty Eighth could finally be written in full sorties, tonnage, losses, and the math that made invasion and liberation possible. A clerk in a Quonset hut wrote tallies in chalk. He was not a hero, but his board told the truth. Sorties, tons, losses, targets. He erased, updated, and stepped back as if reading a weather map. The numbers were not stories by themselves. They were the receipts of a sky-wide war. By May 1945, the 8th Air Force had flown more than 600,000 sorties. The bomb tonnage over Europe ran to the hundreds of thousands, and the single type that should never have been able to do so much, the B-17, dropped well over 640,000 tons by itself. The ledger looks like math. It reads like a continent being freed. Every line in that ledger carries a place and a date. Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943 ball bearings and bitter lessons. Big week in February 19. 44 aircraft plants ripped out like bad teeth. Berlin in March, capital by daylight, again and again. Oil at Mersburg and Lohne, flames that tasted like defeat in German mouths. Rail yards around Kassel and Ham steel rivers clogged and broken. You can follow the numbers like pins in a map and see the Reich's fibers cut and cauterized in order. Bearings, fighters, fuel, rails, centers. Costs were terrible and honest. More than 26,000 8th Air Force airmen died in combat. Many more were wounded, burned, or bailed out into enemy hands. 4,000 bombers did not come home. A chaplain read names until names blurred into silence. A ground crewman kept a wrench in his pocket after a friend's ship failed to return because it felt like a promise he needed to keep for the next crew. The ledger has a sorrow column, and America paid it with clear eyes. And still the machine turned. 12,731 B-17 seconds left Boeing, Douglas, and Vega lines. The G model alone ran past 8,600 airframes, a refinement that turned battlefield feedback into factory change faster than tyrannies can manage. The 8th Air Force did not just fly airplanes. It flew a system, training pipelines, depot ships, tanker convoys, weather charts, radar beacons, radio nets, maintenance cycles, and supply tables that made the sky feel like a road. The enemy's fighters met formations. The formations met their times. Prisoners and enemies gave the most honest footnotes. A captured German pilot in 1944 said, "They come like a schedule, not a raid." Wilhelm Jonen wrote that Allied fighters could pull German machines from the bomber stream like currents, and that German sets and antennas cost speed that could not be spared. These are professionals describing the feeling of being outplanned and outproduced at the same time. There is no shame in courage. There is only the math of outcomes. America bent that math. The ledger also records gifts that do not fit in columns. A British nurse wrote of American crews who landed torn and carried wounded friends to ambulances with the hush of churchgoers. A French rail worker watched a daylight formation pass and whispered, "It will end." A Dutch mother saved a chocolate bar wrapped in oil paper for a child and called it liberation candy. These moments belong in the same book as tonnage because they describe what the numbers protected, the quiet of ordinary life. Look at the scale another way. A single heavy raid could drop hundreds of tons in minutes. Multiply by missions per week, and then months. Add the way Doolittle's doctrine stripped veteran German pilots from the sky and left replacements to face long-range escorts on their first days. Add the way oil burned and trains stalled. Add the way every fort that limped home taught its crew one more trick and sent that trick into debrief for the next crews to steal. The ledger is not just quantity, it is compounding knowledge. And the ledger has a last page that looks forward. The 8th Air Force turned daylight precision into a discipline that would guide aviation long after the war. Bombardiers became engineers and teachers. Pilots became airline captains whose hands never forgot what steady felt like in rough air. Mechanics built peacetime machines that ran smoother because they had learned to make angry engines sing at altitude in winter. Freedom used its wartime skills to grow a world where a kid could read a book under a lamp after dark without fear of sirens. The enemy's side knew the book was closing. German planners wrote fewer confident arrows on maps. They added weather and fuel and engine hours as enemies equal to the Allied air forces. They saw their own numbers shrink into warnings. Fewer veterans, fewer sorties, fewer choices. In that narrowing space, resistance became brave and futile at the same time. A professional looking at those columns tells his family the truth quietly. We cannot win the air. Here is the holy shit truth that deserves a place above the chalkboard. A free nation flew hundreds of thousands of sorties, dropped hundreds of thousands of tons, and absorbed losses that would have shattered a smaller people, and it did so while training, rotating, and improving. The ledger is a love letter written in numbers by workers and flyers and planners to soldiers on the ground waiting for a quiet sky. When they crossed Normandy, the letter arrived as promised. The receipts say who paid for that quiet. The signatures are 10 names in each fortress and millions more on the home line. Only one question remains to close the story. How could one country do what no other nation could build, think, and fly at that scale, for that long, and do it with a generosity that shocked its enemies? Start with a welder in Burbank wiping sweat, a navigator in Suffolk tying his pencil to a string, and a P-51D pilot in Essex checking guns. None of them knew each other. All of them worked inside a system that looked like an aircraft and felt like a country. The enemy misread the system. They saw factories and counted machines. They did not see what those machines carried, a set of values that turn into power when multiplied. Freedom to argue, freedom to learn, freedom to fix mistakes in public, and scale what works. That is the engine room of victory. Jimmy Doolittle read a sign and changed a doctrine because he could. He did not need a whisper from a palace. He needed results, and the men who flew under him expected the same. The new rule, hunters first, escorts second, fit the American habit of pushing decisions down to leaders who could see the sky. Fighter groups experimented. Debriefs spread ideas faster than fear. A trick learned over Bremen showed up over Mersburg, and success became contagious. That is freedom behaving like a weapon. Factories answered with a language just as clear. 12,731 B-17 seconds left Boeing, Douglas, and Vega. The G model rolled out with fixes baked in chin turret for head-on attacks, stronger structures, better heat, better de-icing because line workers and returning crews traded notes, and an engineer could sign a change order on a Tuesday that saved a life on a Friday. There is no whip in that sentence. There is competence, pride, and a goal everyone can own. Get them there. Get them home. The enemy faced this and felt something close to disbelief. Wilhelm Jonen wrote about Allied radar you could carry and German antennas you had to drag. He wrote about being pulled from the bomber stream like a current from a cake. He was not bitter. He was honest. He saw technology married to mass and understood what that marriage means. Initiative moves across the sky and does not come back. A brave opponent can fight that for a while. He cannot win it for long. America also shocked with kindness. German prisoners brought to camps in the United States wrote home about bread, music, and work that paid small wages. They gained weight after years of rationing. They tasted vanilla ice cream and shook their heads at the abundance. None of that changed the battles. All of it changed what those men believed about a free people. This is the secret strength of our system. We do not need to crush a captive to prove power. We can feed him and still win. We can respect the enemy's skill and still end his capacity to harm. That contrast is a mirror. It changes the man who looks into it. On the line, the culture sounded like a laugh in an oxygen mask and looked like a baseball glove in a toolbox. It smelled like hot oil and coffee. It worked because everyone owned a piece. A riveter could stop the line for a measurement that felt wrong. A crew chief could refuse a takeoff for a sound he didn't like. A pilot could change a route on a navigator's calm call. A fighter leader could free hunt because the job was to win, not to perform. These are small freedoms in the service of one large freedom. Here are the facts that stick like thumbtacks. A single American factory pushed out a finished bomber roughly every hour at its peak. B-17 seconds alone dropped well over 640,000 tons on Nazi-held Europe. The 8th Air Force flew more than 600,000 sorties and lost more than 26,000 killed in action doing it. Berlin learned that daylight could be scheduled. Fighter factories learned that roofs can be removed from the sky. Oil plants learned that fire can arrive on time. The enemy learned that courage without fuel, veterans, or initiative is tragedy. The closing scene belongs to a man whose name you already know. Second Lieutenant Robert E. Femoyer refused morphine over Merseburg so he could navigate a wounded B-17 through flak for 2.5 hours and bring his crew over the channel. He accepted relief only when they were safe. He died 30 minutes after landing. That act is the American creed in one life. Duty before self. Training above fear. Teamwork above pain. Multiply that act by millions in factories, on flight lines, in cockpits, and you get the map of a free continent. Germany never expected that a republic could think like an engineer, fight like a prize fighter, build like a nation of craftsmen, and still offer a blanket and a cup of coffee to a prisoner. They expected noise and confusion, then fatigue. What they got was a steady drumbeat. Learn, adapt, scale, repeat. That drumbeat dropped tons, broke backbones, and made the future walk toward liberation whether the enemy liked it or not. So why America? Because we turned values into velocity. Because we let smart people try things fast. Because we gave ordinary hands noble work and the tools to do it well. Because we believed schedules can be moral when they free the oppressed. At the end, when the last contrail faded and the last engine ticked cool, the ledger did not just show bombs and sorties, it showed a nation that kept its appointments with history. No other country could have done it the way we did, with steel and mercy, with hunters and hymns, with a sky made honest at noon.